They heard a woman scream for 3 years. Not once, not twice. For 3 long winters and 3 short summers, the same thin voice cut through the concrete walls of a council block in northern England. And yet, the police log for that address is empty. Not a single call, not a single patrol car. Just silence. The tape you are about to hear was found in an old council flat scheduled for demolition in the late 1990s. A cheap plastic recorder hidden behind a loose skirting board in flat 17. On the label, written in shaky blue ink, there are only 3 words: Moss Side, screams truth. What follows is not a horror story. It is a record of how an entire building learned to turn the volume up on their televisions instead of picking up the phone. Of how a young woman disappeared in plain sight 3 floors up behind a door everyone knew but nobody knocked on. And of how one November night, a single wrong turn down a smoky corridor finally forced the truth out into the cold orange glow of the estate's streetlights. It began on a Tuesday in the autumn of 1983. Rain clung to the concrete like old chewing gum, and the Moss Side estate smelled of chip fat, damp clothes, and spilled lager. On the 7th floor of Block C, in Flat 17, the new tenants had moved in that afternoon. 2 men, a dog, no furniture worth mentioning. In Flat 16, Mrs. Jenkins was trying to retune her portable television. The news read out more job losses, more pit closures up north. Another speech from the woman in Downing Street about tightening belts. Mrs. Jenkins was 62, a widow, her son buried under a white stone that said he had died in the South Atlantic for Queen and country. The council had given her this box in the sky and left her to it. Just after 2 in the morning, she heard it. At first, she thought it was the dog. A sharp, high-pitched sound, thin enough to squeeze through concrete, then choke in the stairwell. Then it came again, longer this time, catching on the edge of breath. A woman, help me. The words were shredded by the thickness of the wall, but the tone was unmistakable. Panic, breathless, and raw. Mrs. Jenkins froze, her tea halfway to her lips. She turned the volume on the television down, just a fraction, enough to make the silence feel real. For a moment, she considered the phone on the sideboard. 3 numbers, 999. They had drilled it into them in school during the war. If you hear something wrong, you call. You do not wait. But this wasn't the 40s, and Moss Side wasn't a village. It was Thatcher's Britain. Here, you didn't phone anyone unless there was blood under your own door. Here, the police came only in vans, and only when there was trouble enough to make it onto the evening news. The scream came again, rising, then cutting off, like someone had put a hand over the mouth that made it. Mrs. Jenkins took a breath, held it, and then did what almost everyone on that floor was doing. She reached for the plastic dial on the television and turned the sound up. In Flat 18, a young man everyone called Big Tommy banged on the wall with the heel of his hand and shouted for them to keep it down. He had an early shift at the warehouse if the agency called. In flat 15, the Khan family knelt on a thin rug, whispering through the last lines of their evening prayer, pretending the noise was just the wind screaming through the lift shaft again. The next morning, the stairwell was full of talk about the screaming. "New lot in 17, one man said. "Proper nutters already." "Probably just a row," said another. "Behind closed doors, that's their business." By Thursday, when the screaming came back, longer this time, nobody even bothered to turn the television down first. From the outside, the Moss Side estate looked like any other Northern Council experiment turned concrete mistake. 3 tower blocks, a low-rise maze, 1 broken playground, 2 shops, and a pub that smelled of stale smoke and spilled bitter. The lifts worked when they felt like it. The stairwells carried the smell of piss and glue all the way up to the top floor. On paper, it was a community. In reality, it was a place people survived. Unemployment had climbed like mold up the walls. The factories that once lit the sky with orange furnaces were now hollow shells, their windows boarded, their gates chained. The men drank. The women pewed at the benefit office and stretched tins of beans across 3 meals. The children learned early which corners to avoid and which names not to say out loud. The police presence on the estate came in 2 forms. In the daytime, there were the occasional patrol cars that cruised slowly by, windows up, eyes straight ahead. At night, when there were riots in other cities or when some lad got stabbed outside the pub, vans arrived, big white teeth on blue wheels. They spit officers out in helmets and shields who pushed the crowd back and wrote in their notebooks that Moss Side was troubled but manageable. Inside Block C, different rules applied. If your neighbor's music was too loud, you banged on the wall. If your neighbor's kid broke your window, you went round and had words. If your neighbor's man was a drunk who liked his fists, you told yourself it was just domestic. The phrase rolled around the estate like a cigarette end, passed from one mouth to another, used to explain away every bruise seen in the stairwell, every shout that cut the night. Mrs. Jenkins kept hearing that phrase at the laundrette, at the post office, everywhere. Just domestic. The lads in the pub used it when they talked about the woman in 17 whose voice had become another part of the building's soundtrack. She's probably as bad as him. They like the drama, some birds. No one seemed to remember her name. The tenancy notice on the board downstairs said Collins, D., which everyone assumed was the bloke with the shaved head and the bomber jacket. The woman was simply his bird. The council office knew more. Somewhere in a metal filing cabinet there was a form with her full name, age, previous address, next of kin. A clerk had typed it in, stamped it, filed it. But the clerk did not live in Block C. They did not hear the screaming at 2 in the morning. They did not smell the fear that seeped through the paint like smoke. By the winter of 1983, the screams had changed. They were rarer now, but when they came, they were thickened by something else. Pain, yes, but also a weight in the breath that made Mrs. Jenkins sit bolt upright in bed and whisper to herself in the dark. She sounds heavier. On Fridays, when the postman delivered the giro checks and the estate flooded with fresh notes, the pub below Block C spilled bodies out onto the pavement. Dean, for that was the shaved-headed man's name, leaned on the bar, telling anyone who would listen that his pregnant missus was doing his nut in with her moaning. "She's hormonal," he said, rolling his eyes. "She screams the bloody place down if I don't come straight home." The men around him laughed, the way men do when they recognize a pattern and are glad it isn't their turn. Not one of them asked if she'd seen a doctor. Not one of them asked if she was all right. Because on the estate, everyone had their own problems. Miners who'd never go back down. Ex-squatties waking up sweating from dreams of burning ships. Families sharing one bar heater in a living room with ice on the inside of the windows. A woman screaming behind a door on the 7th floor was just one more sound in a place that had already learned to live with sirens, smashed glass, and football chants echoing through the night. Before the 7th floor, before the concrete walls and the screams that drilled themselves into strangers' dreams, Sarah Collins had been another face in another northern town. Salford, 1982. The pub still smelled of smoke and spilled stout. Jukeboxes still fought to drown out the sound of the fruit machines, and the buses into the city center still arrived late and left early. Sarah worked afternoons in a small bakery on the high street. Flour in her hair, sugar under her nails. Her world was the steady rhythm of dough and the soft thud of the till drawer. At 19, she was not beautiful in the way magazines suggested, but she had the kind of soft, open face that made old ladies tell her their life stories while she wrapped their loaves. Her mother, Linda, cleaned offices at night and fell asleep on the settee with the television still flickering. Her father was a name, a photograph in a drawer, and a silence at the dinner table. They lived in a red brick terrace where the wallpaper peeled slightly at the corners, and the neighbors shouted at each other through the walls. But they knew everyone on the street by name. The night she met Dean, the rain had just started to fall, thin and mean, over the lights of the working men's club. Sarah had gone with a friend from the bakery, more out of duty than desire. The band was loud, the carpet was sticky, and the men leaned at the bar like they'd been bolted there. Dean did not look like a hero. He was all angles and tension, a shaved head under the fluorescent lights, a bomber jacket with a stain on the sleeve. But he bought her a drink without being asked, and he listened when she talked, or seemed to. He told her about the council flat he'd just got, his own place, no parents, no landlord breathing down his neck. He talked about how he'd been done over by the system, all those politicians in London who didn't care if lads like him end up on the dole or in the ground. Sarah listened and nodded. She liked that he was angry. She recognized it from the way her mother swore at the television when another factory closed. Besides, he made her laugh. He had a way of turning stories about fights and police and stupid mates into something that sounded almost like adventure. He walked her home that night. At her gate, he kissed her. It was not gentle, but it made her feel, for a moment, as if she were the main character in something big. 6 months later, she was no longer wrapping bread in the bakery. She was standing in a drab council office, signing a form that made her Dean's co-tenant in Flat 17, Block C, Moss Side Estate. Linda had cried the night Sarah left, begged her to wait, to think, to find a boy who had a job, at least. "He just needs a chance, Mum," Sarah had said. "We can't all sit and wait, can we?" On the estate, the chance Dean seemed to need most was the chance to be obeyed. The first slap came on a Tuesday. She had bought the wrong cigarettes. The first apology came 10 minutes later. He cried, called himself scum, promised it would never happen again. The second slap came 3 days after that. By the time the pregnancy test turned positive, Sarah had already learned to hide the marks under long sleeves and a careful smile. Dean's reaction was not joy. "Whose is it?" he demanded, eyes glassy with drink. "Who have you been seeing when I'm at the pub?" He didn't believe her when she swore that the baby was his. So he set about making sure she had no one else left to swear to. When Sarah missed their Sunday tea twice in a row, Linda knew something was wrong. Her daughter was not the type to forget. She was the type to apologize for being 5 minutes late. The first time, Linda told herself the buses were to blame. The second time, she rang the flat. The phone rang and rang. No answer. At 10 that night, staring at the silent handset as if it might explain itself, Linda made a decision. The journey from Salford to Moss Side was not long on a map, but it felt like a different country. The bus passed boarded-up factories and graffiti-tagged underpasses. When she stepped off on the edge of the estate, the wind slapped her face with the smell of chip fat and exhaust fumes. Block C loomed against the low sky, windows like dead eyes. The lift was out of order, of course, so she climbed the 7 flights of stairs, stopping twice to catch her breath, hand on the rail, sticky with something she did not want to think about. At flat 17, she knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder. Eventually, the door opened just a crack. Dean's face appeared in the gap, eyes red-rimmed, jaw clenched. "Where's Sarah?" Linda asked. He looked at her for a long moment, then shrugged. "She left," he said. "What do you mean, left?" "Packed a bag. Went. Didn't say where." Linda felt the world tilt. "She's pregnant," she said carefully. He snorted. "Not with mine, she isn't." He went to close the door. Linda put her foot in the gap. "Let me see her room." For a second, something ugly flickered behind his eyes. Then he smiled, wide and without warmth. "Be my guest," he said, and opened the door. The flat smelled of stale smoke and something sweet, rotten at the edges. The living room was a chaos of empty cans, ashtrays overflowing, a smashed ashtray ground into the carpet. The bedroom door was closed. Dean pushed it open. Inside, the bed was unmade, clothes strewn across the floor. A suitcase lay open, half empty, as if someone had grabbed a handful of things and left. The window was cracked open an inch, letting in a thin stream of cold air. "See?" he said. "She's gone." Linda stepped in, trying to feel the room for the warm imprint of her daughter. There was nothing, just dust and the faint smell of the cheap perfume Sarah liked. "If she contacts you, tell her to call me," Linda said, her voice trembling. "Sure," Dean replied. "I'll tell her." On the bus home, Linda sat with her hands in her lap, staring at the dirty glass. Her daughter had vanished between 2 Sundays, leaving no note, no number, nothing. The next morning, she went to the local police station. The waiting room was full of people. A woman with a black eye holding a screaming toddler. A man complaining about a stolen car. An old lady whose handbag had been snatched at the market. When her turn came, she sat opposite a young constable with acne scars and tired eyes. "My daughter's missing," she said. He reached for a form. Age? Name? Last seen? Linda answered every question, carefully, afraid that any hesitation would make her sound less credible. When she mentioned the pregnancy, the constable's pen paused. "Adults go missing all the time," he said. "Have you considered she might have just wanted a fresh start? She wouldn't leave without telling me." He shrugged. "If she's with this Dean, maybe they've just had a row. She'll turn up." "Can you go and check the flat?" Linda asked. "We've got limited resources, love. We'll log the report. If anything else comes up, we'll be in touch." She went back 3 times over the following month. Each time, a different officer. Each time, the same words. "We'll be in touch. She's an adult. She's probably with a boyfriend." They did not write Moss Side Estate in their notebook as a place that swallowed women. They wrote it as a place for domestics, for routine disturbances. On the 7th floor of Block C, behind a door Linda had been invited to glance behind, but not really see. Her daughter was learning the shape of a life measured in locks and footsteps. The day the bedroom door became a prison was unremarkable from the outside. Rain on the windows, football on the telly, the estate humming its usual out-of-tune song of slamming doors and shouted threats that never quite reached the point of action. Inside flat 17, Sarah stood in the kitchen, one hand on the small of her aching back, the other washing dishes in lukewarm water. Her belly, 7 months along now, jutted in front of her like an accusation. Dean sat in the armchair, ashtray balanced on his knee, eyes on the screen. "I saw your mum the other day," Sarah said carefully, trying to keep her voice light. "On the bus." Dean's eyes slid from the television to her face. "You what?" She hadn't, not really. It was a test, a small lie to see how tightly the net was woven around her. "Just saying," she added quickly, "she misses me." Dean got up slowly. The room seemed to shrink around his movement, air sucked out by the force of his attention. "You been going to Salford behind my back?" "No, I just—" He took a step towards her. "You calling me a liar? Saying you been on buses I don't know about?" Marcus sniggered on the sofa. The sound was thin and mean. Sarah felt the familiar cold bloom in her chest. She tried to back away, but the sink was already at her spine. I haven't been anywhere, I promise." The slap came fast, a practiced motion. Her head cracked against the cupboard. Stars exploded behind her eyes. Plates clattered in the sink. "You don't talk to no one," hissed, his face inches from hers now. "You don't go nowhere unless I say." From that day, the bedroom door stayed closed whenever he left the flat. At first, it was a chain slipped through the handle, just in case of burglars. Then he fitted a bolt on the outside, hammered in with the precision of someone who had considered this step long before taking it. Sarah's world shrank to 4 walls and a window that looked out over the estate like an eye that had given up blinking. The curtains stayed drawn. He let her out for meals, but only when he was home. The bathroom door stayed open while she used it. He read her letters before she posted them, and opened any that came with her name on the front. Soon, none did. The screaming that the neighbors heard in those early months was not just fear. It was protest. It was refusal. It was the sound of someone still convinced that, if she made enough noise, if she made herself unbearable to ignore, the world outside the concrete would have to answer. But the world did not answer. The world turned the volume up. She learned quickly that the screams earned her nothing but bruises and cold dinners. So she changed tactics. She went quiet. She watched. She waited. From her side of the door, she learned the pattern of Dean's footsteps on the lino, the different rhythms of his anger and his boredom. She learned when Marcus was alone in the flat, restless and talkative, and when he was gone for days, lost somewhere in the estate's darker corners. One night, she heard them arguing in the living room. "She'll have the baby soon," Marcus said. "So what's the plan?" There was a pause. Sarah held her breath. "We'll figure it," Dean muttered. "Maybe she'll behave once the kid's here. And if she doesn't?" Another pause, longer this time. "We'll figure it," Dean repeated, and turned the volume up on the television, so loud that whatever else he said drowned in canned laughter. Mrs. Jenkins had lived through the Blitz. She remembered the sound of bombs falling on Manchester, the way the ground shook, the way people screamed and then went silent. She remembered digging through rubble with her bare hands, looking for her neighbor's cat, finding instead a child's shoe. She had survived all that, and now she was 62 years old, living in a concrete box that leaked when it rained and froze when the heating broke. Her son was dead. Her husband was dead. The only company she had was the television and the sounds that came through the walls. The screaming from flat 17 had become part of her routine. Tuesday nights, usually. Sometimes Fridays. She had learned to anticipate it the way she anticipated the bin lorry on Thursday mornings or the church bells on Sunday. But in the spring of 1984, the screaming stopped. For 2 weeks, there was nothing, just the usual sounds of the estate, shouting children, car alarms, dogs barking. Mrs. Jenkins found herself listening more carefully now, straining to hear something, anything, from next door. One morning, she saw the girl in the stairwell. Sarah was being walked down the stairs by Dean, his hand clamped around her upper arm like a vice. She was heavily pregnant now, belly swollen to the point where it looked painful. But it was her face that made Mrs. Jenkins stop halfway up the stairs and stare. Gray, hollow, eyes sunken so far back into her skull that they looked like bruises. "Are you all right, love?" Mrs. Jenkins heard herself say. Sarah's mouth opened. For a moment, it looked like she might speak. But then Dean turned, his smile cold and sharp as a knife. "She's fine," he said. "Bit of morning sickness. We're very happy, aren't we, babe?" Sarah nodded, a small mechanical movement. Mrs. Jenkins watched them disappear down the stairwell, Dean's hand never leaving Sarah's arm. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the estate settling around her. Footsteps above, a door slamming below, a siren in the distance. She thought about the phone on the sideboard in the hallway. 3 numbers, 999. She got up, walked to the phone, picked up the receiver. The dial tone hummed in her ear, steady and expectant. Her finger hovered over the 9. What would she say? That her neighbor looked ill? That she'd heard screaming months ago? That she had a bad feeling? And what if Dean found out it was her? What if he came knocking on her door in the middle of the night? What if he did to her what he was clearly doing to that girl? Mrs. Jenkins hung up. She went back to bed, pulled the covers over her head, and tried to convince herself that it was not her responsibility, that someone else would call, that the girl probably deserved it somehow, that this was just how life was on the estate. But when the screaming started again, 2 nights later, louder and more desperate than before, Mrs. Jenkins turned the television up so high that the woman downstairs banged on the ceiling with a broom handle. The contractions started just after midnight on a Wednesday in June. Sarah had been lying on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, when the first wave of pain rolled through her belly like a fist clenching. She waited, counted, breathed. When the second contraction came 10 minutes later, she knew. She banged on the door, softly at first, then harder when no one came. "Dean!" she shouted. "Dean, it's happening!" She heard footsteps, voices raised in argument. The bolt scraped back. Dean stood in the doorway, face flushed with drink, eyes glassy. "What?" "The baby. It's coming." He stared at her for a long moment, then turned to Marcus, who was hovering behind him. "We can't take her to hospital," Dean said. "Too many questions." Marcus nodded. "So what do we do?" Dean ran a hand over his shaved head, pacing. Sarah doubled over as another contraction hit, this one sharper, longer. She screamed. "Shut up!" Dean hissed. "You'll wake the whole bloody building." "I need help," Sarah gasped. "Please." Dean left the room. She heard him on the phone, low, urgent tones. 20 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. The woman who entered was skeletal, yellow-skinned, reeking of alcohol and stale tobacco. She carried a stained canvas bag and moved with the tired efficiency of someone who had done this too many times in places no hospital would ever see. "Right then," she said, kneeling beside the mattress. "Let's have a look." The birth took 4 hours. Sarah screamed until her throat was raw. The midwife, if that's what she was, muttered instructions and smoked between contractions. Dean and Marcus stayed in the living room, television turned up loud enough to drown out the noise. When the baby finally came, slipping out in a rush of blood and fluid, the midwife caught her with practiced hands and laid her on Sarah's chest. "It's a girl," she said flatly. Sarah looked down at the tiny red face, the screwed-up eyes, the small fists waving in the air. She was alive. She was breathing. She was perfect. "Grace," Sarah whispered. "Her name is Grace." The midwife cut the cord with a pair of kitchen scissors, wrapped the baby in a towel that had seen better days, and held out her hand to Dean. 50 quid. Dean counted out the notes. The midwife pocketed them, packed her bag, and left without another word. Sarah held Grace close, feeling the warmth of her daughter's body against her own. For the first time in months, she felt something other than fear. Hope. Fragile, dangerous hope. Dean stood in the doorway, staring at the baby with an expression Sarah couldn't read. "What now?" Marcus asked from behind him. Dean shrugged. "We'll see." The door closed. The bolt slid home. Sarah looked down at Grace, at her tiny fingers curled around Sarah's thumb, and made a silent promise. "I'll get us out. I don't know how, but I will." Grace learned to walk in a room 8 feet by 10. Her first steps were from the mattress to the wall, small, unsteady movements, cheered on by a mother whose voice had become a hoarse whisper from lack of use. Sarah rationed everything, food when it came, water from the tap in the bathroom when she was allowed out, hope most of all. Dean had grown bored of them. He came into the room less often now, sometimes forgetting to bring food for days. Marcus was worse, paranoid and unpredictable, his eyes glassy from whatever he was putting into his veins. The flat had become a squat, a place where people came and went at strange hours. Sarah heard voices she didn't recognize, laughter that sounded wrong, the smell of something chemical burning. Grace was 18 months old when the breakthrough came. It was a Friday night. The flat was full of noise, music, shouting, the sound of glass breaking. Sarah held Grace close, covering her ears, whispering stories to drown out the chaos. Then the bedroom door opened. A woman stood in the doorway, young, bleached blonde hair, eyes wide with drink or drugs or both. She stared at Sarah and Grace for a long, frozen moment. Who are you?" the woman whispered. Sarah's throat closed. She couldn't speak. She just stared back, holding Grace tighter. The woman backed out slowly, pulling the door closed behind her. Sarah waited for Dean to burst in, for the shouting, for the violence. But nothing came. The party went on. The door stayed shut. The next day, the woman, her name was Tracy, Sarah would learn later, woke up with a hangover and a memory that wouldn't leave her alone. A woman, a baby, in a locked room. Tracy tried to convince herself she'd imagined it. She tried to forget, but the image stayed with her, sharp and accusing. 3 days later, she called Crime Stoppers from a phone box in town, voice shaking. "There's a woman being held in a flat on Moss Side Estate, Block C, Flat 17. She's got a kid. Please, someone needs to check." The operator took down the details. The call was logged. It went into a pile with dozens of others. Reports of stolen cars, drug deals, domestic disputes. It sat there for a week. Then a young detective constable named Helen Frost, 26 years old and new to CID, was assigned to clear the backlog. She read the report, cross-referenced the address, and found something. Sarah Collins. Missing person report, filed January 1984. Last known address, Flat 17, Block C, Moss Side Estate. Helen Frost picked up the phone and called for backup. They came on a Tuesday morning in November 1985. 2 uniformed officers and DC Helen Frost climbing the 7 flights of stairs because the lift was broken again. The stairwell smelled of piss and old smoke. Graffiti covered the walls. Team names, threats, declarations of love spelled wrong. At flat 17, Helen knocked. Firm, official. The door opened. Dean stood there, shirtless, tattoos dark against pale skin. He looked at the police with the practiced indifference of someone who'd been visited before. "Yeah?" Helen showed her badge. "We're looking for Sarah Collins. We have reason to believe she may be living here." Dean's face didn't change. "Sarah? She left me ages ago. 2 years, maybe. Mind if we have a look?" For a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Then he shrugged and stepped aside. "Be my guest." The flat was filthy. Ashtrays overflowing, takeaway boxes piled in the kitchen, a smell that made Helen's stomach turn. She walked through the living room, the kitchen, opened the bathroom door. Nothing. She was about to give up when she heard it. A sound, soft, muffled. A child crying. She followed it to a door at the end of the short hallway. It had a bolt on the outside, locked. "What's in here?" Helen asked. Dean was behind her now, too close. "Just storage." "Open it." "I don't have the key." Helen turned to the uniformed officers. "Open it." One of them stepped forward, shouldered the door. The bolt groaned. The door swung open. The smell hit them first. Human waste, sweat, rot, despair. Inside, on a stained mattress, sat a woman holding a toddler. Both were skeletal, filthy, eyes too large for their faces. The woman looked up at Helen. Her lips moved, barely a whisper. "Please, help us." Helen Frost would later tell journalists that she had seen bad things in her career. Murders, assaults, crime scenes that stayed with her long after the case was closed. But nothing, she said, had prepared her for the moment she stepped into that room and realized that a woman and child had been living in hell for 3 years, while an entire building turned up the volume and looked the other way. The trial took place in the summer of 1986. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the press gallery. Outside, protesters held signs calling for longer sentences, for justice, for someone to answer the question everyone was asking. Dean and Marcus sat in the dock, blank-faced. Their defense argued that Sarah had stayed willingly, that she was free to leave at any time, that the locked door was for her own safety. The prosecution presented medical evidence: malnutrition, untreated injuries, psychological trauma so severe that Sarah struggled to speak in full sentences. They called witnesses. Mrs. Jenkins took the stand, crying so hard she could barely speak. She admitted she'd heard the screaming, admitted she'd almost called the police, but didn't. "Why not?" the prosecutor asked. "Because I was scared," she whispered. "Because on the estate, you don't grass." Big Tommy testified next. He admitted he'd heard the screams, thought it was just a domestic, none of his business. The Khan family said the same. So did the man from flat 18, and the woman from flat 15. One by one, they admitted it. They had all heard. They had all known. They had all chosen silence. The jury took 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Dean was sentenced to 20 years. Marcus got 15. Outside the courthouse, Linda Collins stood in the rain, holding Grace's hand. Sarah was still in hospital, too weak to attend. The journalists shouted questions. How could this happen in 1980s Britain, one asked. Linda looked at the reporter, her face hollow with grief and rage. Because nobody cared, she said quietly. Council estate girls don't matter. Not to the police, not to the neighbors, not to anyone. She turned and walked away, leading Grace through the crowd. Sarah never returned to Moss Side. She changed her name, moved to a town where no one knew her story. Grace grew up not knowing the first 2 years of her life, protected by a mother who had learned that survival sometimes means forgetting. The estate remained. Block C still stands today, though it's been refurbished, painted over, rebranded as affordable housing. But if you walk up to the 7th floor, if you stand outside flat 17, some say you can still hear it. A woman's voice, thin and desperate, cutting through concrete. And if you listen very carefully, you can hear something else. The sound of televisions turning up. The sound of doors closing. The sound of an entire building learning to live with ghosts.